Today's conversation is called Queering the Workplace. We are everything everywhere all at once. And in this session, we're going to talk about the transformative power of bringing multidimensional ways of thinking and being into our work, and how this can serve as an antidote to power over and binary thinking. And it's about appreciating fluidity and adapting to change and ultimately bringing the lessons of queerness to everything that we do. So I'm really excited to have my friend and collaborator, Tania Cheng, here to talk with me about bringing fluidity to work. And Tania works with social impact organizations to find strategic clarity, design services and processes, and facilitate change through the lenses of innovation and design thinking, systems thinking, liberatory practice, and inclusion. And Tania's work is informed by 15 years of experience in leadership roles, advancing youth engagement, climate action, gender equity, and entrepreneurship. So thank you so much for being here, Tania, and I'm really thrilled to have this conversation with you. And you can probably, I'm sure you've already noticed that this is going to be a bit of a goofy conversation. We will be talking about some big, serious, important ideas. And also we're trying to bring a spirit of play in the spirit of bringing queerness into the work that we're doing. And so this... Yeah, so Tania has a googly eye on their forehead, and I have a Post-it note with a circle on my forehead. For those of you that are familiar with the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, this probably makes sense. And for those of you that aren't, it will come up in conversation. But just wanted to acknowledge that this might not be exactly the conversation that we often have when we're talking about workplace leadership type stuff. So thank you for joining us on this sort of experimental journey that we're on. So Tania, thank you so much. I'm really excited that we're having this conversation. We've been talking about it for quite a few months. We actually got together and watched the movie together and got really nerdy about it. It was really fun. And I want to just start off before we kind of get into some of the context of what we're really talking about. I want to just start off by asking you, Tania, if you would tell me the story of how you came to this work, like what brought you to facilitating change?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, thanks for having me. This is super fun. I'm already like giggling to myself because we're doing a talk about this movie that is so hilarious. So I can't wait to get into that. And I'm excited to have this conversation with this room of what appears to be really awesome people, and hoping that we can find space to bring you into this conversation. Yeah, in terms of how, like my own story and how I got into this work, I've always kind of been a bit of a shit disturber, you know, like even as a kid, my parents would tell me I should be a lawyer because I'd ask all these questions and talk back so much, and was definitely the black sheep of my family. But I think it was in high school that I started to develop a bit of a social and environmental consciousness. I had joined the environmental club at my school, and through that experience, I had gotten involved with an organization that combined cycling and theater to promote sustainability. And it was just a really awesome organization that focused on very positive, play-based, participatory approaches to change. And I feel like at a time that I was just, you know, quite young and learning, it was very transformative for me, and continue to serve as a bit of a foundation for the work I do today. When I was 23, I joined a group of young people as part of this organization on a 2-month bike tour across the Maritimes. I was with 16 other young people, and we were biking and using theater to promote sustainability in different communities. And a bit of a trigger warning here because I'm going to mention death, but about a week into our tour, sadly, we were dealt with a pretty serious tragedy when 3 of my teammates were hit by a truck on the highway, and one of them was killed in the accident. And it's a way bigger story than, you know, I can really do justice to in this conversation, but essentially, in brief, that was a hugely transformative experience for me. We ended up finishing the tour, and I think we did it in a way that really honored Andrew's memory. That was his name. And for me, I was 23, Andrew was 23. You know, I was just coming out of undergrad, figuring out next steps. I was literally in the middle of discovering my own queerness. And here I was learning for the first time just how short and precious life is. And it really made me become more intentional about the choices I wanted to make in my life and my work. And anyways, long story short, that's what led me to really pursuing a career path or work journey in the work that I do. It's led me to youth engagement and environmental education and all the things Brooke has mentioned. And these days, trying to work with social impact organizations to think outside the box and work better together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tania. So we're going to come back to the specific work around sort of thinking out of the box and working well together on all of those pieces, because I think obviously that's a huge part of what people are interested in hearing about. But before we get into that, I want to just bring in the movie, right? Because when we started having this conversation about what you wanted to talk about, the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once came up, and there was sort of this conversation that we had about feeling really inspired by the themes in that movie. So it's a rollicking good time. It's totally ridiculous. It's like completely just out of this world in terms of a movie. Like, it's one of the most fun movies I've seen, but there's also all of these like themes that run throughout it that feel really meaningful in this way, right? So I want to talk about that a little bit. So what is it about the movie that felt really connected to queerness for you?
Yeah. Oh, such a good movie. Okay, how many, I know this, it's not a huge group, so how many people in this room have seen the movie? Like, either show of hands, or if you're off camera, like do the raise hand thing. Just kind of curious if you're going to understand the references we're going to make. Okay, cool. A good number of you. Okay, if you haven't seen the movie, go see the movie. It's great. But if you have seen the movie, it's like Brooke said, it was wild. It was just like, the entire time I was watching the movie, I was like, what the F is going on? At its heart, it's about, like, I mean, I resonated because it's about this immigrant Chinese family and their queer daughter who just wants to be seen and accepted for who she is. And the whole time I'm like, it's me. And then you layer on, there's like this complicated mother-daughter relationship, been there, and the power of kindness and gentle leadership, that the father displays, and this idea of fracturing yourself. Oh, I love this. Just like, it's a movie about multiverses. There's many universes, and you can jump to other universes. But essentially, this character Joy like fractures herself in the pursuit of purpose and belonging, and finding herself in these other universes. It's so relatable, and I feel like also it wasn't just the story, but the way the story was told, right? It was the way that it was completely unexpected. Like, it was wild. There's like a universe where they're rocks. There's a universe where they have hot dog hands. There's a universe where, I don't know, they're having like a fight scene with dildos. Like, it's just unbelievable. And it's like, it's wild and silly in a way that the whole time I was watching, I was like, okay, this has got to be like queer people were involved in the making of this movie, and yeah, I just loved it, and it felt to me like a display of what like queer ingenuity could look like on screen, and what it could look like in the world, and it told a beautiful story and won 1 million Oscars. So I'm not the only one who thinks that. But anyways, Brooke, I'd love to hear what you thought about the movie and how it's a metaphor for queerness.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think some of the things that really came up strongly for me were the universe jumping. So I was thinking about that in terms of, like, you mentioned fracturing, but I also think that there's something, and there's this way that I think a lot of people who experience sort of marginalization in a range of different ways, but particularly, talking about queerness, there's this sort of feeling of like, I am this person in this space and I'm this other thing in this other space. And I think like queerness as a way of being in the world has really kind of embraced that and recognized that there's a strength in that it's actually, there's a lot of possibility in being able to identify all of the different ways that we can be, and kind of be okay and able to kind of world jump between those different ways. So for me, that felt really, and I'm sort of like, I think there's something in that's really interesting to think about around, I'm always thinking about conflict, and I'm thinking about workplaces, and I'm like, that ability to have that fluidity and that world jumping possibility, to me, feels like there's so much potential in that for actually shifting how we engage around stuckness, around polarization, around, like all of those kinds of things. Yeah, it's like, it's part painful, the fracturing, and it's also partly an opportunity for making choice and having fluidity. And I think that's the piece that feels excited, right? Or exciting. It's like we don't really know what's going to happen, but if we are willing to do some weird things and try out some unexpected possibilities and just sort of play, that really interesting, unexpected, creative things might come of it, right? And I feel like that's like the definition of innovation, and it's also just feels so related to queerness to me.
Queerness is innovation, man. I mean, for sure, like that spirit and the creativity that brought those scenes to life, like that's the spirit I want to see more in workplaces. Like that to me is like an exemplification of queerness. And like, why can't our offices be like this? That's what I want to see.
Totally. The creativity that brought hot dog hands into the movie, right? Yeah, totally.
That's right.
So, just to kind of like frame this a little bit, because we're throwing around sort of a few different terms and a few different ideas. So like, what does it mean? How would you describe to someone who sort of is like, oh, are you talking about making the workplace more accessible to queer people or more inclusive? Like all of these things are really important, but that's not exactly what we're talking about today, right? So if you were to try to explain what it means to bring sort of like a queerness into a workplace context, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. Oh, I love this question because, I think for me, queerness is so much more than gender and sexuality. And that's important. That's a huge part of it, for sure. But the way I think of queerness is as a bit of a philosophy, like as a way of being and experiencing the world. It's existing outside of all of these normative structures and understandings of race and class and gender, etc. All the things. And one of the descriptions I really love, it's in this book called Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz, and he describes queerness as a rejection of the here and now and an insistence on potentiality and concrete possibility for another world. Queerness as a longing that propels us forward, as a mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. Oh, so good. Like that is what I think of when I think of queerness. It's just like this faith and belief in something else, something different, something better, and helping to shifting from that narrative. I think the conventional narrative of queerness is shame and survival, and moving away from that a bit and moving towards like shame to pride, and from surviving to thriving. Like, what's that really look like? From suffering to joy, from isolation to community, and so when I'm thinking about queering the workplace, I don't just mean how do we make our workplace more inclusive of queer people. That's important, of course, that's really important. But there's a lot of content out there already on that. I'm talking about how can we all bring the spirit of queerness into the way that we approach work and workplaces. What about you, Brooke? What does queerness mean to you?
Yeah. I mean, it's just like, it's so many things. I absolutely love everything that you've said about that. Like I totally feel that. And also, it's funny because you're wearing a googly eye, which was sort of the symbol of the kind of like hopeful possibility, love-based, and I'm wearing the bagel, which was sort of the symbol in the movie, for those of you that don't know, of nihilism, fracturing, destruction, like all of these kinds of things. So, not that is actually how I feel about things at all, but it just felt important to bring into this definition a recognition that, that like there is also connected to what Tania is talking about, which is so beautiful and important and filled with possibility, that a lot of it is actually coming from people's experiences of oppression, lack of belonging, like violence, harmful relationships, all of these kinds of things, and isolation and lack of support. So it feels like really important to me to also to like have that present, that it's like we want to, in thinking about what it means to queer anything, and particularly, you know, as we move toward thinking about workplaces, it's like we need to hold, it's important to hold both of those, right? There is the beauty and the possibility and the magic and the flair and all of the, and the rainbow and the pride and like all of these things. And then there's also recognizing that there's a real struggle, and that struggle is ongoing, and that is about equity, and that's about belonging, and, you know, that's about sort of like people's diverse and different identities within queerness and all of this. And so I think it's sort of like, you know, like there's sort of the you know, there's this idea within sort of social transformation of that there's like an old system that is on its way out, that's kind of like dying, and there's new systems that are desiring to be born. And what Tania is describing is sort of like what you're describing is sort of this new system idea, right? And building the new world, and in the creation of that new world, how do we support and compost and bring along the parts of ourselves or the parts of each other or the parts of our systems that are important and that need some support to be able to move toward that beautiful new world. So yeah, I guess like I just felt like that was important to kind of
yeah, for sure. There's so many roles to play along the journey of systems change, and there's lots of models that can describe those roles. And absolutely, there's an existing many systems that are very oppressive that require like good people to help transform. And then there are people who are in the space of thinking about what could something different look like. And so for sure, like acknowledging that there are, like, it's hard out there, you know. I mean, I don't have to even start listing all the different isms that we're dealing with, and some people are we're just trying to get by, and it's not safe for everybody to be bringing their queerness into the workplace, right? And so acknowledging that that's not an easy thing for anybody really, and given all of these extreme crises we're facing in the world, like it's pretty easy to get sucked by the bagel, right? To be really overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of it all. And that's what in the movie, that's what they're talking about, like this everything bagel. It's like nihilism, it's giving up. It's like, what's the point? There's nothing I do will make a difference. And I don't know, like I feel like that's a state that a lot of, again, trying not to generalize too much, but I feel like a lot of people can relate to that state of being, of like, you know, figuring yourself out. And at least growing up in the time that I did was not always accepted. And so having to experience that hopelessness of what's the point of it all? I'll never have the life that I want, and all, you know, nobody's going to accept me, all these things, feels analogous to like being able to see the complexity and the challenges in the world and the overwhelm of it all, and the feeling like it'll never get better. And being able to sit with that and still choose and still make the choices that you can to move towards joy and hope and love and connection. I feel like there's something that a lot of queer people have to do to survive, is to make those intentional choices over and over about how to put their energy towards the things that are good and possible. And that shows up in the movie, right? The character Wayman, he talks about it, about how seeing the good side of things is, he says it's strategic and necessary, you know, and it's how he survived in the world. And he's like this sweet, lovable kind. Some people might think he's weak, but he's one of the strongest characters in that movie because of his ability to see the good. And, you know, I think about Adrienne Maree Brown's Pleasure Activism. And, you know, in that book, she talks a lot about joy and liberation as a strategy, right? Like we have to take care of ourselves. So even holding the truth that it is hard and that it does take some privilege to exit that sometimes, even in that state, there are choices. And especially as for those of you who are leaders, I mean, we're all leaders in different ways. There are choices in leadership. And as long as there are some choices, there's an opportunity to choose what's possible, what's good, what's, you know, and to keep kind of love at the center. And that's something I'm trying to do in my work, and trying to give more energy to what's possible and what's right in front of me, instead of energy towards the everything bagel. It's not always easy, because I am the kind of person, it's funny, Brooke, we've had this conversation about just the type of work that we do. And I actually think I have a tendency to get sucked by the everything bagel. And all the more reason why I'm so intentional about trying to stay where the joy is, and trying to stay where the fun and the energy and the possibility is. But yeah, there's some privilege in that too.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to get in. I just want to remind people before we sort of move on to like that's such a beautiful little segue that you did into the next thing that I was going to ask you. Just a reminder, if you have questions or you have comments, like we'll have specific time for that in a little bit. But if you want to drop them in the chat or want to put up a hand or something like that, we absolutely will take a pause and respond to whatever you want to contribute to this conversation. So that's just an open invitation whenever it feels like the moment for you. But sort of like continuing with sort of where you just kind of led us, what does this mean in terms of your work? Like how are you actually bringing some of these sorts of ideas around possibility and fluidity and queerness and these kinds of pieces into organizational work with workplaces, which is like, actually, when you really think about it, our workplaces tend to be the least playful places that we spend our time, right? So tell us a bit about how this shows up in terms of supporting leaders in workplaces.
Yeah, for sure. It's something I think about a lot and very much am still in the journey of, so I am not the expert, but you know, I remain inspired by the time that I was on my bike tour. I was with, again, 16 strangers biking across 3 provinces. There was no leader. We got some training beforehand, but we had to figure out how to be together and keep each other safe. So we did things like we made decisions by consensus. We organized cooking squads and rotated responsibilities. We had this chore wheel that had roles like being the navigator or the meeting facilitator or the gratitude giver, and we'd rotate that every day and everybody had a different role. We were silly. Like, we spent a lot of time dressed up in costume for some reason, and like singing and dancing and just having a lot of silly fun. And maybe that's part of it, is just like youth and being in a like suspended in a kind of time and place that felt like it was outside reality. But you know what? That was also the first space I'd ever felt safe being openly queer. Granted, part of that was because a lot of the other members were also queer, but still, it was also that spirit of queerness that was very alive in that group. And so that's something I tried my best to bring forward in my work. And in terms of organizational culture work, a lot of that looks like, how do we bring participatory processes into the workplace and distributed leadership models and practices. One example of how that shows up, or how I think queerness can show up in the workplace, is the ability to imagine many possibilities. So, you know, like, again, the movie really demonstrated that with the many possible universes, and they're all weird and silly and awesome, and like brought it all together. I feel like with, at least for me, and I think a lot of queer people, like, you kind of have to imagine the impossible. Growing up, when I was a teenager, you know, and figuring out, you know, some of my stuff, same-sex or same-gender marriage wasn't legal yet in Canada. So it like it wasn't in the realm of possibility for me to be married. And so it took a little bit of, I don't know, like subconscious imagination to believe that there would be a different kind of future for me. And, you know, at work, I think that looks like coming up with new ways of doing things. It's drawing from these different universes of our lives and being able to string it all together into new ideas, new solutions. I don't think it's going to shock anyone here that the solutions like the type of thinking it's going to take to solve the problems we have is not the type of thinking that created them. That is not my quote. That's somebody much smarter than me. But we're going to need that level of creativity, and it's going to come from unexpected places. And that's what I think queerness can inspire, because we're kind of used to that. Anyways, an example that comes to mind of that is in fiction, there's this like emerging genre of solar punk fiction, and we talked about this too, Brooke. It's the opposite of dystopian fiction, which I love. And there's like this new kind of like utopian fiction and like speculative fiction, and a lot of this is driven by queer people. Like one of the books I love is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, who is queer, and it's about like this utopian future with like a non-binary character and a robot, and it's beautiful. And it's like, I need more stories and narratives like this. And what if we could bring these kinds of stories and narratives into our workplaces, into whatever work it is that we do?
Yeah, and I think, I think when I think about systems change work, like people who are working explicitly in systems change type stuff are very connected to the idea that we need that the future is going to be very different, that we need to be thinking about possibility and creativity and all of the many different possibilities and all these kinds of things. And I'm still sort of like coming back to this sort of feeling that that's not something that is accessible to most workplaces in this moment in time, because there's so many structures that are very traditional about how people engage in work. So I'm wondering, just for people who might be sort of participating or listening in this, who are kind of like, oh my goodness, my workplace is so far from being able to like, engage in like that kind of imaginative play and thinking and possibility generation and all of these kinds of things. Like, can you give an example? I know you're doing some work specifically with organizations that are trying to move toward more horizontal structures and are trying to move toward more innovative ways of being. Could you give like a really tangible example of what, like, something that people are doing to be able to kind of move into that sort of possibility realm?
Yeah, I think it can show up in so many ways in terms of the play piece. Some of that is bringing in elements of play into as simple as your meetings, right? Like if anybody does improv here, there's lots of amazing improv games that you can slip in as a way to generate creative thinking. In terms of how I'm seeing this play out in organizations, I'm working with a number of organizations who are really thinking deeply about how to move away from like very strictly hierarchical structures and towards more horizontal and more distributed ways of working. One example of how that can show up is detaching roles to a particular person and reimagining roles as roles of an organization, and people being able to hold many roles. So that's part of that is a mindset shift of a very binary approach, right? A very like this or that, or like, you have one job and one job description. And again, think about possibility in many, moving towards this idea of multiplicity, of holding many things. There are challenges with that too, not to say that's a perfect approach. But even just that mindset shift of being able to hold multiple roles, and I'm not just the communications coordinator, but I support the organization in these communication functions, but also in these other functions. That is one example. I think another way is bringing forward whole body approaches to your work. So I think in workplaces where we tend to be very up here, like in our heads, it's all about the intellectual. And there's lots of small ways that we can bring, like, mind, heart, body, spirit into our workplaces. Again, like I focused a lot on what can we do together in the times that we gather. So in our meetings, in our like facilitated workshops and whatever sessions we have, how can we have a moment to pause, have a moment to breathe, right? And talk about our emotions and feelings. Again, like not easy stuff. It does take some work to get there, but these are the kinds of things I'm working on with organizations to kind of shift away from kind of the dominant approaches to work, to something a little bit different that brings our whole selves to it. In not in like the, we can all bring our whole selves to work, like not in I don't know how to explain this, but like in a way that feels safe.
Yeah, totally. And it's like, and I'm hearing you talk about it, that's partly about relationships. That's partly about sort of doing the work to build relationships that have some trust and have some playfulness, and where people maybe feel people feel safe enough to be able to take some risks with each other, and be a little more open, because there's that sort of broader sense of like, this is how we're doing things here. And we're doing that in a way that we want to like really support people to feel like they can step into it.
Totally. Yeah. It's not easy, but yeah, the trust and relationships are everything. So finding opportunities to really get to know each other on a deeply human level, I think is super important.
Yeah. There's one question, which is, Tania, could you actually repeat the book title? I think it's the Becky Chambers.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, there was Becky Chambers, A Psalm for the Wild Built. I can type that into the chat. And also the other one was Cruising Utopia. I guess I can't type that to everybody in the chat. Maybe
here, I can type it. I'll type it to everyone. Cruising
Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz.
And Psalm for the Wild.
Psalm for, it's such a delightful little read. It's great.
I know, it's been on my list. It's like my favorite. It is also my favorite genre.
Yes. And that's like coming from someone who's like obsessed with Black Mirror, which is like the opposite.
The opposite, yeah. That's the dystopian. That's the everything bagel.
I am very drawn to the everything bagel. Like, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm very drawn to the everything bagel. It takes a lot of work to stick with this googly eye.
Yeah, and it's like that is part of it, actually. You sort of said this later, but I just want to kind of like what you're saying, I think is really important, that it's like there is a constant intention and choice to be trying to notice and moving toward that possibility and that playfulness and curiosity, and what might that actually bring, what might that be able to shift. But it's not easy. It's like a journey to do that.
Totally. Yeah. And I think it comes a bit with just looking around and starting to notice the things that are kind of like, wait a minute, why do we do it like this? And again, like, I think a lot of that queerness brings a lot of that, because we kind of have to question some of the structures we're just told are the way things are, right? Like, I mean, like, who says I have to raise children in this nuclear family? Like, who says I have to work in a workplace with this one boss? Who says I have to work for one person? Like, all of these questions start to come up once you start unraveling that thread. And I think that's a superpower. I think that's the beginning of starting to come up with the possibilities. And I joke that the way that I work now, because I work as an independent consultant, but I joke that I take a polyamorous approach to work, but it's not actually a joke, it's for real.
It is for real. You're like, I have 10 bosses, not just one.
I have 10 lovers. But honestly, it's like, why am I subscribing to this monogamous way of working that is literally in the legal definition about ownership and control? And again, all acknowledging that, like, stability and security, and it comes with many perks and all the things, it's important for many people, so don't want to diminish that. But I don't know, in my journey, as I've been like unraveling these threads, I've just been like, why am I doing this? Like, if I can do something different and try something a little different, why wouldn't I? And so I've been trying and just reframing some of the way that I'm thinking about the work that I do. And yeah, now I have many lovers and I get to choose who they are, and we get to choose each other and set the terms of our relationship. Yeah, totally. It's a lot of fun.
So when you think about this piece that's sort of like, these sort of early, or these questions about like, who says we have to do this? Why are we doing this? Like, why are we following this structure that actually doesn't make sense and that is making us all miserable, or is that making our culture toxic, or sort of all of these kinds of things? Like, what is the role of leadership in sort of allowing and enabling people to start asking those questions, start making some of those shifts?
Yeah,
that's a really big question, I recognize. So no pressure.
I'm going to throw that back at you after this. Well, I mean, I think okay, so in any form of leadership role or roles that you may hold, there's power in it, right? Like that's part of the definition, I think, of leadership is like some ability to move people. And so there's power in that. And as this comes from Spider-Man, great power comes with great responsibility. Not my quote. But I think it's true. It's like anytime there's power, there's responsibility and an opportunity to try something. And so I think a big responsibility of leaders is to bring what is weird to the work, like what is a little unexpected to the work, like what is the queerness that you can bring to the workplace that makes it okay. Because every time I still think about like growing up, all the moments that people you stood up for queer people or like expressed something that seemed accepting. It was like this tiny little window opened up a little bit more for me to be who I turned out to be. And I couldn't have known that at the time, but I know every single one of those moments now, tracing back. It's like, when my sister took me to the play, my lesbian Jewish Wiccan wedding, I forget what it's called, something like that. That was like the window opening up. And so as leaders, you have this like massive opportunity in everything you do to close that window or open that window for someone. And you have no idea what that impact is sometimes. Like you might not know generations later, years later. But I think the posture you can bring to it is, okay, like what is the weirdness in you? What is the thing that's unexpected? What is the thing that has been, suppressed by society in shame that you can start to unwrap a little bit and show off to the world? Because probably that's one of the most beautiful parts of you. And that's the stuff that's gonna inspire other people to also show their most beautiful parts of themselves. And when we can all bring our most beautiful parts of ourselves together, maybe we just might create a better world.
Yeah, totally. And I just want to say that Mackenzie has just asked a very connected, relevant question. So I'm going to offer you this question and then you can kind of keep going with this topic, kind of following Mackenzie's question. So the question is, are we also inviting folks who are allies to take the time to enter into queer ways of leading, even though they aren't part of the community directly? Any thoughts on this for us aiming to lead with open hearts in creative and innovative ways?
I kind of have this radical belief that we're all a little bit queer. But not in like, again, I don't just mean gender and sexuality. Okay, like I'm taking a very expansive definition of queerness. And what I mean by that is like, we all have a part of us that has been hidden, shamed by society, that feels different, that feels a little bit like you don't belong, that, just you're afraid to show. And I know that's not the, what most people talk about when they talk about queerness, but that's how I'm imagining and thinking about it. And so I think absolutely, yes. Like I think everybody can look within themselves and find that part of them that is a little bit unexpected and different, and bring that out in some way. Like nobody's telling you to go on stage and start, singing musicals or anything, but like in some way, whatever that looks like, in your relationships with your colleagues, in the meetings that you have, in your conversations with your bosses, like how can you insert just a little hot dog hand in there, and see what might happen. But that's the spirit I'd love to see more of. I actually think would make a huge difference in some of the challenges we're facing in the world today.
Absolutely. And I think just to sort of, clarify what we're talking about, like in terms of the sort of queerness, like when we talk about queerness, what we're really, in this context, what we're really talking about is bringing in a sense of play, a sense of possibility, a sense that it's okay to really be wacky and, playful and all of these kinds of things. And like really challenging, because I mean, it's interesting, I think, when I think about queerness, when I think about queer joy, as opposed to sort of the sad, hard, difficult parts of queerness, when I think about queer joy, that is extremely playful. It's very bright. It's very flamboyant. It's playful. It's curious. It's like all kinds of things are acceptable that would not be acceptable in kind of a more normative mainstream sort of context. And so it's about bringing in the curiosity and the playfulness and the fluidity and all of those kinds of things, which actually is about creating more opportunity for other people to be able to step into their own sense of play and possibility and openness, right? And so it doesn't really, like what we're talking about, it doesn't really matter what your actual sexual orientation is or your gender identity or all of those kinds of things. It's about creating an environment, right? It's about creating a sense of possibility, and that it's like, it's totally cool if this is who you are and what you want to wear on a particular day, or like all of those kinds of pieces. Yeah. Do you want to add anything else?
I love that. I feel like you just described that so much better, but just exactly that, like the fluidity, the sense of levity, like how to just like not take yourself so seriously, and give, like, just remove that pressure valve a little bit so that people can just be. And when people can just relax and be, like, they might surprise you. So I think that's part of what we're talking about.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting because Tania and I are kind of working on a project together, and Tania's role is really about the transformation to the new system. And my role is really about the hospicing and supporting people to kind of let go of some of the things that are holding us stuck in some of the older patterns. And so there is both of those, right?
What's your secret?
What's my secret?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, what's my secret? Like, I kind of just follow what's happening, right? Like when something comes up that is a pattern that is not the pattern that people are wanting to move toward, I support them to process that either individually or with each other, or, through some sort of training, or, it's like, there isn't really a secret to it. It's about supporting. It's about recognizing that, like, we're going through a change process. This change process is something that we're all excited about, but humans fundamentally hate change. Like, I think it's almost universal that there's very few people who are really, truly comfortable with change. And it brings up all of our fears, and it brings up our reactions and our defensiveness. And so it's about actually, and I think this is part of queerness, right? It's about looking toward possibility and also loving and caring and supporting the parts of ourselves that are kind of like, oh, this is really overwhelming and I don't want this change, or can't we just keep things the way they are? And like recognizing that transformation is actually painful, even if it's a transformation that we want. And so I think that's sort of been my role in that process, right?
And it's so important. Like, it's such a critical role. And again, like, I think queer people have had to be very creative about how we resource care in our lives, right? Totally. Like we've had to, a lot of us have had to go outside of our nuclear families and really build a sense of community care and find mutual aid and look to friends and stuff. And so it can, we don't have as much attachment to certain structures, but and I've always loved someone taught me once that every change is experienced as a loss, and that's always stuck in my mind. Because there's something that you're losing, even if the what's coming is great and wonderful, but there's something that is ending or changing, and there's loss in that, there's grief in that, and depending on whatever your background stuff is, other things might come up. And so it's really important to have the care and attention to process that so that you can really welcome in the new. So I love that that's the work that you're doing, Brooke, and that we get to work together on this stuff, because it's not easy, but it's important.
No. Yeah, totally. Yeah. There's a couple more things in the chat that I just want to bring our attention to. So Candace says, Tania mentioned improv. Just wanted to share a great place to learn and practice improv, which is improvcollege.ca, which I'll put into the chat to everyone. It's accessible online. There's classes available for those who are interested. So thank you so much. That's a great suggestion. There's the link to that. And then Mackenzie says, that's lovely. The spirit of both your words make a lot of sense. I think a lot of us as allies are worried sometimes about power dynamics, and there's relief in a lot of what you're saying. So thank you. Yeah, and I mean, the power dynamics are super real, and it's important to be holding that and to be recognizing that that's there, and that people will, even with your best intentions, people will sometimes be hurt by things. And so it's not, it's about, like, I think also, like, coming back to what you were saying, Tania, about the sort of mutual aid, community care, all of these kinds of pieces. I think that is a fundamental thing that workplaces also really need to integrate more into the ways that we are together, right? Like, we spend more of our time at work than we do awake pretty much anywhere else in our life for people who are working sort of in a full-time kind of context. And so that's a lot of time for people to bump up against each other and, cause harm and, cause conflict and lead to all kinds of things that have to sort of get addressed and processed and all these kinds of things. And so how, as workplaces, and there's some really beautiful models around that, but how can workplaces actually really integrate a sense of, like, we're in this together, we are going to take care of each other, we're going to care for ourselves, we have accountability, and we need to make sure that things happen that need to happen, but we also are going to do that within a culture of care, right? And so I think there's, like, that is a piece of that power dynamic piece that you were sort of bringing up, that I think it's like, what's your process for addressing things that happen that don't feel good, for addressing moments when power feels like it's used badly? Like, how are people encouraged to take accountability for that? Or like, all of those kinds of pieces are also part of this, right?
How can we bring in group accountability, shared accountability? Like, how can some of these tensions be surfaced together rather in back channels, or like, I have to go over your head, like, in these other ways? But how can, but again, like, it takes a lot of trust and relationship building and safety building to get to that place. But when you do, then, you can hopefully have some of these conversations out in the open, right? And get together with your people and say, like, look, like, this is, I'm noticing this tension. Can we talk about it? And problem solve together. Not easy stuff, but these are some of the conversations that Brooke and I are having, and looking at different models and examples of how to bring that kind of different ways of working into the workplace. And some of that is looking at different organizational structures, but a lot of it is a bit of a mindset shift. It's like just detaching a bit from the power over mindset and towards more of a, we're in this together, we're all working on this thing together. I don't have this one role and one job. We all have responsibilities in the caretaking and the caregiving of what it is we're doing together, just like we do at home and in our communities. Like, we all have, a piece of that responsibility in the caregiving of our homes and families and communities. That's true too in our workplaces, but capitalism tells us otherwise and gives us specific tasks to do. But I imagine this world where it's possible that we can work together collaboratively and beautifully.
Thank you, Tania. I feel like that's a really beautiful, it's like such a beautiful ending point, and we are getting close to that. But I actually just want to ask if there's any other comments, any other questions, anything that you want to ask Tania before we have to wrap up for today.
Feel free to come off mute too if you feel comfortable doing so. Join the party.
I feel like we should have, like, streamers or, some sort of, like, confetti sort of thing happening. I tried to wear my confetti shirt, but
I have a whole bag of googly eyes that I wish I could just distribute to everybody.
Okay. Well, I will take that to mean that there are not questions or comments or anything that anyone wants to say. So, Tania, thank you so much is there anything, actually, before I close up, is there anything else you want to say as a final word on this?
Oh, no, I'm good. I've done a lot of talking, but no, thank you everybody for coming today, and I hope you have fun. I definitely had a lot of fun, and if you haven't seen the movie, go watch the movie. It's amazing. And feel free to reach out if you want to follow up and have a conversation about queerness in the workplace, because I like thinking about this stuff and would love to not have other people to think with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to be sending out an email that will include Tania's contact information, so you can go ahead and reach out to them if you are wanting to. And otherwise, thank you all so much for coming and for your questions and your presence. And Tania, thank you so much for having this conversation. I think for like the third time, maybe, but like it's totally different every time. But it's like we've talked about this, like we watched the movie together. Anyway, it's been.
I talk about this for hours and hours.
I know it's been
fun.
awesome. So thank you so much for doing this with me. And I'm like just totally. I totally love the work you're doing, and it's a pleasure to be able to work with you when we're able to do that. So thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great evening, afternoon, and wishing
bring the sun. Bring the sun.
Yeah, if you're in Nova Scotia, where's the sun? Help us out here.
All right, have a good one, everyone.
Bye, everyone.